Our first presentation deals with building a diversified e-commerce portfolio. Our presenter is Keith Anderson, SVP of Product Strategy and Insights for Profitero. Keith, take it away.
Thank you, John, and thanks to yourself and Linda. We always enjoy participating in these virtual conferences. Good morning, everybody. I'm Keith Anderson. As John says, I lead strategy for Profitero. We're an e-commerce performance analytics partner to almost 100 global brands, and Nielsen's preferred e-commerce analytics partner. What I'm going to present today is work that our team, especially Sandy Scroven and Andrew Pearl, two of my colleagues, and I have collaborated with some of our friends at Kantar Consulting, especially Malcolm Pinkerton on. And I think we're relatively well known for our Amazon data and analytics. And you've heard us present at past virtual conferences on maximizing your performance with Amazon, through Amazon, and so on. And, you know, as we've continued working with customers and the industry, it's increasingly clear that there's interest and, frankly, a need for not moving past Amazon or leaving Amazon, but thinking beyond Amazon in terms of really two big topics, where to play. So if I'm going to focus on Amazon, where else should I focus? And then how do I think about allocating scarce resources like my team and my time and budget? So that's really what my discussion this morning is about. You'll hear me a couple times reference other work that we've done that goes into more detail in some of these areas. And so if you'd like to get these materials or the other materials, visit our website or just email me at keith@profitero.com. Happy to share all the work. So our rough agenda is really, briefly reiterating what I hope everybody acknowledges at this point, explaining why you have to make Amazon a priority, then thinking through how to prioritize the markets and the retailers that matter, and then finally talking about how to right-size and rationalize your engagement model based on the resources that you have. So here's some of the Kantar Consulting data, really looking at global fast-moving consumer goods, FMCG sales growth in 2017 versus the previous year. I don't think this comes as news to anybody. All retail in most developed markets is growing in the low single digits. E-commerce is growing in the mid to high double digits. And when you look at the share of growth, e-commerce represents a significant majority in some categories, actually all of the growth. In other words, brick and mortar is retracting. That's not true in many of the categories that I think our attendees today represent, but it is true in some. And so when I started working with this industry, there were a pretty significant number of companies that were asking the question, is this going to happen and do we need to do something? And thankfully, with each passing year and now quarter, very, very few companies that we encounter are asking those questions. They know that they need to do something. The question is, what do we do and where do we do it? And so I do think, having seen the context of what's happening to the volume and the share that's shifting online, the most thoughtful and forward-looking companies are thinking more broadly about the impact that digital has and how it transcends sales volume. So I think some of you may listen in on a presentation later in today's virtual conference on reverse engineering Amazon search engine. And as I hope you'll hear in that presentation, not only is it important to rank favorably in Amazon's search results to sell more on that channel, but it influences the rest of retail. Many shoppers, myself included, expect to find a product online, usually at Amazon, whether I'm standing in an aisle or on a bus or wherever. And whether I ultimately buy from Amazon or not, I do want to see what people think about it. A quarter of the population in the U.S. is checking Amazon reviews. And, for items, this 80% is at some point, not 80% of transactions, people are checking prices online, but there's no question, even beyond the volume that's accruing to Amazon or e-commerce, there's increasing influence over decisions that still get transacted offline. And there are brands that are investing and have seen really significant performance. Notably, when we made this slide, General Mills and Blue Buffalo were separate companies, but as I think everybody knows, they're getting together. But these are all public statements that these companies have made, either at analyst meetings like the CAGNY events that happen annually or in their investor updates. I think what's clear, and I was with, by the way, these are all clients of ours, and I was with one of these companies yesterday, and they said very clearly, this is a priority, that is, e-commerce is a priority for our company from the highest levels on down. And I think that's the very first step in the process, is having executive endorsement. But it is causing some complexity because even when it becomes a priority, most manufacturers are grappling with existing distribution and trading relationships, especially in grocery and mass and maybe drug channels. And they have a lot at stake, not only volume-wise in those channels, but they've built a route to market and category management disciplines and shopper marketing teams and approaches and, an entire way of working that's optimized around relatively different channels. And so they now are trying to understand if this is a strategic priority, how do we prioritize and where do we place bets? And when I say place bets, I don't mean to suggest that anybody is attempting to pick winners. But, there are some tough decisions to make about where to play. And so sometimes it's as simple as our largest retailer wants us to support e-commerce because it's a strategic priority for them. In other cases, it's, as is the case with Amazon, you just can't avoid it. You can't go an hour without either a positive or a disruptive effect that Amazon is having on essentially everybody's business. But then there are so many other, interesting but not entirely clear opportunities. Could be a specialist player like Chewy.com, which in the pet food business is one of, if not the leading online pet retailers. Or it could be a company like Instacart that I think most of us, if we stuck to a traditional definition, wouldn't even think of as a retailer. But I don't think you can argue that they aren't becoming an interesting and important intermediary between brands and shoppers. So there's a lot of concern and questioning and effort underway at a lot of companies to figure out where do we prioritize and where do we place our bets. And so I've shared this with some of our clients, but as I as I did last week when I was in Bentonville, where I started my career around this time. This is data from some equity analyst reports that shows the concentration of sales that Walmart had in 2003. So in those days, it was not uncommon. This is sort of at the tail end, I suppose, of the incredible growth of the supercenter, which, I forget exactly at what pace Walmart was adding stores, but it was basically a store a day, if I recall. You would have top 50 or top 100 global suppliers who had anywhere from 10 to 30% of their volume concentrated at Walmart. And if you ask those same companies what percentage of your growth did Walmart represent in the 90s or the latter half of the 90s, for some, it was greater than 100%. That is, everything else retracted a bit, and Walmart accounted for all of the growth. That on the upward trajectory, that ride can be exhilarating and really positive because, with that pace of growth concentrated in a single customer, you get a lot of economies and efficiencies, and you can make many decisions one time and build plans and strategies one time that then get executed at scale with that one customer. The challenge, as I think everybody probably appreciates, is when you are that concentrated with any one customer, if that customer sneezes, not only do you catch a cold, but sometimes the whole industry catches a cold. And so, this is a slightly cautionary tale, if nothing else, this discussion today, which is to say, clearly in e-commerce, Amazon is the leader, and in fact represents, depending on how you define the e-commerce market, let's call it approximately 40% of U.S. e-commerce, and in some categories less, and in other categories even more. And they have not yet hit the kind of headwinds or faced decelerating growth that would really significantly disrupt their big suppliers. But wouldn't it be nice if we diversified before that happens rather than after? That's what we're talking about. So if you've heard me present, you may have heard me talk about the importance of defining success. This is really important in any exercise, but especially in exercises about where to play and how to win, because if your objective is growth at any cost, it may lead you to play in different corners of the landscape than it would if you, for example, have a really differentiated premium or luxury brand whose equity you really want to defend, and you want to be so protective of where that brand appears that you may be more than willing to sacrifice volume for equity and so on. So I'm not here to tell you what the right answer is, but anytime somebody comes to me and says, where should we be focused, we first need to have a conversation. And they should be discussing at the executive level and across functions about what their objective and goal is for changing where or how they're distributed, because different objectives lead to different answers. So you do have to make Amazon a priority. I've never seen anything like Amazon's growth trajectory in the retail industry. There are some great precedents that are similar in some ways. Walmart, notably, Aldi, IKEA. There are some Inditex. There's some incredible growth stories, but I don't think there's precedent for a company that over a 20-year time scale has hit the volume or the scale that Amazon has and kept up its rate of growth. And I'm a bit of a curmudgeon on this point, but most forecasts that you look at, whether of Amazon sales or e-commerce or anything, they start with whatever the year-over-year growth rate was last year, and then they taper that growth rate in the forecasted years. For example, if Amazon grew 25% last year, next year they'll probably grow 20% year over year, and then they'll grow 18% the year after that and 16% the year after that, because they couldn't possibly maintain this pace of growth as they get bigger and bigger. Could they? Well, they could, and they have. And I think there's a lot behind it. If you look back about a decade, a little bit longer, there were a few developments that seem to have been rocket fuel for Amazon's growth. The launch of the Prime program, which we now know has more than 100 million members globally. The launch of the third-party marketplace, which massively expands selection without putting Amazon on the hook for the inventory or even the logistics in some cases. Those are a few of the things that really launched Amazon's growth in the retail side. And then, of course, Amazon Web Services is emerging as not only a huge contributor to the top line, but a huge profit center too. No question they're growing in some incredible ways. They do have, in addition to incredible impacts on industry growth and sales, they have these incredible impacts on how shoppers feel about different channels and how they behave in different channels. So I think this is just some data, again, from our friends at Kantar and their Shopperscape survey. But what's very clear in their data is that on the dimensions that Amazon openly tells the industry they focus on, selection, value, and convenience, they do seem to have set the bar for customers' perception. And I think, notably, dealing with Amazon, as with many retailers, but there are some nuances at Amazon that make them even more important to prioritize early. And I think I suspect you'll hear more about this later today in the session focused just on their A9 algorithm. But there's what Amazon has described as a flywheel effect, and that simply means through a lot of consistent and concerted effort over time, you start to see outsized performance that builds momentum without you having to increase your effort proportionally. And what that means is essentially success breeds success. So part of what I suspect you'll hear in the reverse engineering of their algorithm, and what we would tell you is one of the biggest factors is sales. So an item that is selling well is going to rank more favorably in search results, which means that item is going to get more traffic, which means it's going to sell more. So it's a little bit of, the new college graduate's dilemma. Everybody wants 3 years of experience, and nobody's hiring without experience. So here, the more experienced you are, the more experience you get at being on the pages and in the positions on those pages where you need to be. There also are really important sort of lock-in mechanics at Amazon, like Subscribe and Save, their auto replenishment program, and now with the rapid emergence of voice, there are so many use cases for voice. I think we're really just scratching the surface, but the most common shopping-related use case so far has been reordering an item in your purchase history. And so just as in online grocery, where, somewhere between 20% and 35% of the orders are triggered by a shopper's favorites list or their past purchase, again, you've got this sort of chicken and egg dynamic where what people are going to buy on a given visit or trip is highly correlated with what they've bought in the past. And so how do you become somebody that they're going to buy? Well, so easy. Become somebody that they've already bought. So all of this just implies get in the game as early as you can, learn how the platform operates, influence the platform, and there's a lot of value that accrues to those early movers. One company that we work with has shared with me that not just specific to Amazon, broadly, they've concluded when they are the first mover, they over-index at about 120, and when they're a latecomer, they under-index at about 65. So in other words, they've basically done the probably very expensive consulting study to quantify the value of getting in early in new channels, and that was their conclusion. So you're going to have to focus on Amazon, but I do want to highlight all of the reasons you want to focus on others in addition to Amazon. From a market point of view, or even potentially from a retailer point of view, a handful of lenses that can be helpful for identifying where to play are, number one, growth rate. So in other words, irrespective of the current market size or the scale, or retailer size or scale, something that is growing exponentially could, in a short period of time, relatively short period of time, emerge as a must-win opportunity. And so an example of that, in my view, might be something like Instacart. The pace at which they are onboarding markets and partners, to me, as it has for several years, makes it something that you really need to understand and engage with, even if you're not, you look at the volume that they're doing and conclude, well, if I put them on a list of biggest customers, they wouldn't be in our top 10 or our top 15. Fair enough. But if you held their growth rate constant for 5 more years, where would it put them? Scale is really more about what's already somewhat mature. So, if you were prioritizing markets or retailers, this would be take a look at the annual top 250 or top 500 lists, just rank order largest to smallest, and that's your list. And then percentage of total is really all about proportionality. So South Korea, just from a market point of view, is an interesting example. As a percentage of the total, e-commerce and especially online grocery is much larger than it is in the U.S. or even in a market like the U.K., which is more mature, at least in online grocery, than the U.S. And so it may not be the fastest growing market globally, and it may not even be a large market or in the top 5 or 10 by scale. But it is disproportionately important in that market, and so if you're already there, you can't avoid it. Or if you have a unique competency, maybe you're really good at e-commerce, that's an interesting market because your strength in e-commerce will give you outsized advantage if you go into that market. So when you're launching an effort to figure out, well, what are our options and where should we play, this might be a couple helpful ways to think about it. And data from friends at Kantar highlight some markets that sort of fall into different buckets here. The U.S. is both large and growing reasonably quickly. And so I think most people are prioritizing the U.S. either because this is where they are or because it's so big. China is just incredible. It's a large market that is outpacing the growth rate of the U.S. and other mature markets. And then markets like the UK are growing quickly, not huge, but again, from a percentage of total perspective, especially in the grocery business, the UK and France are more mature than the U.S. So there's no single answer for your business. It depends heavily really on two things. One, what are your objectives? How have you defined success? And two, what's your existing footprint? But this is how we see companies thinking about focusing on where to play. And China has become, I think, for many companies, a frontier that's increasingly accessible for Western brands, but that despite many similarities is not the same as any Western market, and can't be approached the same way. And so we have many clients who are investing aggressively in China broadly, and especially some of the key players there like Tmall and JD. And we equally have others that have looked at China and said, we know it's large scale. We know that the growth is setting the bar, but the economics and the route to market are not for us at this stage. We're going to let others pursue that market, and that's fine. And so this is not intended to convince you you have to be in China. It is intended to illustrate in a very simplified way how companies are looking at markets or retailers and saying, should I be here, and is it right for me, as it is for many others. So I want to talk about the retailer side and how to think about both selecting retailers and maybe most importantly, supporting different retailers based on the existing constraints. And that's so important because, again, when I was in a market like Bentonville last week, at an event with a lot of folks on Walmart account teams that are either designated or fully dedicated to supporting Walmart.com or Walmart Grocery or Jet or Sam's Club online. They are sort of looking at some of their counterparts that work with Amazon or others and saying, I'm sorry, your budget's how big? I'm sorry, you have how many people on the team? I'm sorry, you get what kind of tools? And so the reality is you can't deploy people, effort, tools, or money equally across everywhere that you might want to be present. But what you can't do is think about segmenting your customer portfolio and then aligning some of those resources appropriately. So this is a very simple framework that looks at a few of those dimensions that we've already discussed. Scale, how big are they? And you may look at it as how big the retailer is, or you may look at it as how big your business with them is. Both approaches are valid. And then the same is true for growth. How quickly are they growing, or how quickly are we growing with them? And the third dimension is a little more subjective, and it's fit or alignment. So the simplest example I can give you, again, is Chewy.com. If you sell yogurt, it may not be a particularly good fit. That is, the alignment may not be high. But if you sell dog treats or bark collars, a little different story. They may not be the largest scale retailer in the industry, and you may not already be doing incredible growth with them, but boy, wouldn't they be a great partner because of their category expertise, or their service model, or the depth of selection they have in your category, or the unique ways that they promote or present products like yours. So that's the general framework. And in this top left quadrant, a maintained customer is basically somebody that is an incumbent, part of your established customer portfolio that isn't doing much to remain relevant. So you're basically going to hang out. You're going to continue supporting them to the level that's necessary, but perhaps not beyond that. You don't want to accelerate their decay, of course, but they aren't taking a proactive stance to invest in the areas that are going to yield growth, and they're not going to bring you with them, therefore. So, maintain and do the minimum, essentially. The invest aggressively quadrant would be anybody like an Amazon, who is already large scale and is setting the bar for growth. But I would argue somebody like Walmart would also fall into this quadrant, especially if you think of them holistically as both an online and an offline retailer. So in a purely online retail sense, I know that their scale is not comparable to Amazon's, but they are among the largest scale online retailers outside of Amazon. And if you look at Walmart, including Walmart.com and grocery and Jet and so on, in addition to their brick and mortar business, I just don't see how you can avoid them as a leading scale-based player. And they are growing, and they're definitely investing. So this is clearly a quadrant where you're going to want to not just show, but you're going to want to play to win. And that means it means some of the things that we'll describe, but it especially means bringing the right dedicated resources. So making sure that you have people who do this and nothing else. And it means that in addition to all of the fundamental transactional things that you're going to do with any customer fairly and equitably, you want to be sure that you are investing jointly with this profile of customer to make sure that you're growing together. There's another profile of customer that's really worth doing some experimentation with. I think of a retailer like Boxed as being perhaps for some of our attendees a profile of retailer that this is a good example of. They are the kind of folks that are growing very, very quickly, have a new and different approach to selling the same types of products that Walmart and Amazon and Instacart all sell, but they're doing it a little differently. And there are almost certainly things that you can learn and perhaps internalize or reapply, and at the same time move some pretty interesting volume. They're not going to be a top 5 customer this year for most of us, but they are a mover and shaker that's worth establishing relationships and an early mover advantage with now. And in that specific case, especially because their selection is so edited. In other words, if there's only 1 or 2 options in a category, it's good to be one of those options. And watch and wait is really, I hope, self-explanatory. I'm basically saying do nothing and be intentional about that. Perhaps you have distributors that are putting you in distribution of these accounts, but these are the types of players that you may not engage with directly, may not have a dedicated account team, and so on. So I did give you a little bit of a sense for what we mean by fit. This is sort of a sample questionnaire, self-diagnostic. I'm not going to read it to you, and it's not exhaustive. But if you are looking at one of those top 250 lists and trying to get a sense for the more subjective dimension in our framework, this is what we mean. Okay. So we've now said, of course, we got to do business with Amazon. If we don't, others will, and there's clearly some advantage to being there and being there early. I think most of us may be U.S. focused, but we've talked a bit about on a global stage, in addition to the U.S., what are some of the interesting markets, or at least how would we identify them? We've definitely talked about how do we think about the right retailers to focus on. And what I wanted to conclude with is once you've identified where to play from a market and a retailer point of view, how do you bring whatever resources you have to bear to maximize your performance? And again, as I share with the examples of people that are on one account team and maybe doing e-commerce in addition to shopper marketing, and they look at some of their counterparts on other teams, maybe the Amazon team, that has 11 dedicated people with one person for media and one person for content and somebody for supply chain and a data analyst and an executive. They sort of say, how am I supposed to do in 30% of my time what those 11 people are doing in 100% of their time? And so ultimately it comes down to deciding what not to do and identifying points of leverage with whatever you've chosen to focus on. So I'll share one framework for identifying those points of leverage now, but this is, again, just sort of an example. So there are many ways to segment the e-commerce landscape. A very simple way, not the only or even the best way, but a way, is the following. Amazon or Walmart or Jet.com are sometimes referred to as spearfishing retailers. That's an Amazon term. I didn't invent it, but it's used because in those types of models where the selection is nearly endless, people tend to know what they want when they visit the site or launch the app. They tend to search, and their average order tends to have an item or two. Boxes are models like Prime Pantry or Boxed. In those cases, people are ordering somewhere between, call it 5 and 15 items. At Boxed, at least the last they disclosed it publicly, their average order was 12 items. And they have a slightly different model where the importance of search is still high, but the way that people find products is as often browsing. And then baskets simply refers to Amazon Fresh, Walmart Grocery, any other inherently local full basket service, whether it's click and collect or delivery. And there the average order can be north of $100, 25, 30 items. And so naturally, the same way that the trip type and the shopper mission in a convenience store is really different than in a supermarket, the same thing is sort of true in e-commerce. And consequently, the weight of different strategies or tactics for attracting, engaging, and converting shoppers varies a little bit. So this is a spider chart that sort of shows you, based on these different models, what you might consider emphasizing or de-emphasizing. And I share that simply because we see in so many of our customers and folks around the industry, as you learn more and more about what it takes to perform in e-commerce, it is overwhelming. There are a million things that you could do. And here, this shows you, just over a half dozen things that you could focus on: search and where you're positioning category listings, and your content and your reviews and your promotions. And you might say, oh, how hard is that? It's like the 4 Ps. There's only 4 things. But then you unpack all of the work that's embedded in any of these areas, and you realize, oh my goodness, how can I ever get all of it done? And so the way you get it done, in essence, is by listing everything that you could do, rank ordering it based on expected impact, and saying, first, I'm going to do what I expect will have the biggest impact. And as it relates to these areas, if it's a Jet or a Walmart.com model, you're definitely going to want to focus on search because that's how most people are going to find you. But if it's a Walmart grocery or a Peapod or a Fresh Direct model, you're not going to ignore search, but you won't focus on it as singularly as you would in a spearfishing model. Instead, you're going to look at things like category placement and the favorites list, because those are a little more balanced in their importance in that type of model. And secondly, you may have a fully articulated team dedicated to help you, and you may not. And so, all I'll simply share as I try to wrap up here is, depending on the team that you have, you will need to either specialize or generalize based on function or work. In other words, the same person or individual or team may need to be the salesperson and moonlight as a data analyst, or may need to be the salesperson and manage content. Or if you've got the resources, you may specialize and have different people for those different functions. And the other dimension is you may have somebody dedicated to an account or a customer, or you may have to generalize as a shared service across customers. You'll also have to think through, what do we keep in-house, or are there partners, consultants, agencies, brokers, etc., that can help us externally.
A question came in, Keith. What about data scientists?
Love them. You should have some data science, ideally in-house. I will say we see more and more companies with a data scientist, if not a data science team. I pity these people because, we have, I won't reveal how many we have, but we have a lot of data scientists working purely on data and analytics for e-commerce through retailers. And the data scientists at many of our clients are being asked to help figure that out, plus 50 other things. So it's not unlike what we're discussing. The scope of what they have to do can expand to the point where it's overwhelming. And so then you do have to go through an exercise like this entire discussion, which is where do we see the greatest potential to impact the business, and therefore what do we do first, and what do we defer or decide not to do. But I do think data scientists are worth in sourcing if possible, and there are companies outside that can help.
Okay.
This is just a simple example of what a team looks like, but I'm looking at the clock, and we are essentially at the end of my prepared remarks. Just to summarize, Amazon is such an important retailer. You absolutely have to focus on it. But if you heard nothing else, the message today is do Amazon and as an industry, we should all be eager to identify, engage, and support uh, other players in the ecosystem because it's the best thing for the industry, the economy, and especially for your business. And you won't be able to invest equally in every market or every retailer. And some of those important decisions about team and tools and budget have long life cycles and only happen once every year, if that often. So part of the exercise is identifying what you can really impact with what you've got today, and then how do you build a case for getting the resources you need for tomorrow. So with that, John, I'll leave it to you whether we've got time to take a couple questions.
Yeah, we have certainly one that came in. What's the next two categories that are going to shift to a majority of sales online from brick and mortar? What advice do you have for manufacturers in those categories?
What a great question. So I think grocery, and I guess more broadly CPG, is clearly at the inflection point today. It still is low single digits in terms of the percentage of that industry that's purchased online. But the availability of options for ordering online are just exploding through click and collect and online grocery delivery and all of these other models that we've mentioned. And so that clearly is one of them. And the short advice, I think, is already well heated. It's imperative that you move now. It may be incremental, but even if it's not, if you're absent, other brands will be present. And we've seen in almost every category new entrants get that early mover advantage and vault to an industry leading position much faster than was historically realistic. Secondly, there are other merchandise categories, I think, like apparel, that in some ways has already matured online, but is clearly becoming a focus for both Amazon and Walmart. And then there are even categories that we may not associate with retail directly that are also not immune. I think regardless of your category and how mature it is online today, almost everything is going to be eligible for online purchase. And the growth rate of e-commerce will outpace brick and mortar. So I think the same advice I shared for grocery and CPG applies to almost everybody. If you're not already there, you don't know what your objective is, and you don't already have a strategy, a team, tools, and some institutional knowledge about how to perform, my goodness, you got to get going.
Okay, thank you, Keith. We have to close this session out, but if you have more questions or would like more information, please reach out to Keith at Profitero.com.